Welcome to Bottled Petrichor, a podcast dedicated to discussing key topics in Islamic history and thought. In addition to a short lecture at the start of most episodes, we ask our guest experts questions submitted by listeners and allow them to share their thoughts in a safe environment. Please visit our Twitter page for feedback and question submission forms. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy. We are going to shift our focus just a little bit and talk about the Qur'an. As listeners may be aware, Dr. Van Putten is an expert on the study of early Quranic manuscripts. And so I wanted to ask, what does the study of manuscripts entail? How do you get into the field, and what's the training like?
Well, really, so me getting into the Quran came from a linguistic perspective. I started off with this research project, actually planning to work on something slightly different from what I'm doing right now. I said I was going to look at the Arabic of the early Islamic period more generally. So looking at papyri, looking at transcriptions in different languages, these kinds of things. But the more I started working on that, I realized, look, the Quran seems like a pretty important resource for understanding the Arabic of the early Islamic period. It seems weird that nobody's written about this, and this is really, it's still something that baffles me to this day. Basically, since Karl Volles, who wrote a somewhat crazy book in 1906, nobody has really done a linguistic study of the Quran by the Quran, and that is a real shame because actually, it is a very ancient text, and the text that we have today, despite what some people might have you believe, is extremely well preserved. And really, even the text that we have in the modern print editions is very close to what we find in early Islamic manuscripts. That is the rasm, that is the consonantal skeleton of the text, is very close to what we find. That is without the dots or almost no dots, without the vowels, these kinds of things. So it's still a fairly ambiguous text, but that part of the text is very well preserved. But before I could start, but there are some differences, and the text has changed in its orthography and certain spellings here and there, and these things are linguistically relevant, so that's why I wanted to get into it. So I started looking into manuscripts and see what they did, because sometimes I got a spelling in the say the Cairo print edition, the most common text form of the text that we have today. It's like, I didn't expect this spelling here. Why is it spelled like this? And I looked in the early manuscripts, like, hey, it is actually spelled differently from what we see here. And that made me realize how important it is to look at these manuscripts and better understand its textual history, so we can also understand the linguistic history of the Quran. So that's basically how I got into it. And what was my training like? I mean, it's all self-taught to a large extent, and that in combination with, of course, just reading a lot of literature and having great colleagues like Eleonore Sélard and even François Desroches, who've done wonderful work and have taught me so much about these things. But it's all self-taught. It's not a big field working on manuscripts. It's bizarrely a lot of people are on Twitter and doing wonderful things with these things, but it's not a big field. So you just kind of teach yourself as much as possible. But what does it entail? Well, there's all kinds of ways you can look at a manuscript. So first of all, I think one of the things that interests most people is how old are these manuscripts, and how do we know how old these manuscripts are? Frustratingly, we have very few early complete Qurans. Very often, large parts are missing. Sometimes smaller parts are missing, but we hardly ever have complete things. And moreover, we hardly ever have a written date on these manuscripts. So for the first 2 centuries or so, we basically have no dated manuscripts. That is not to say that in the first 2 centuries there were no manuscripts. But we have to figure out ways to show that they're older than you might want to put them. And how do you do this? You look at the script style. How does it develop? How has it developed over time? How do these things interrelate with each other? You look at the ornamentation and see if you can make certain connections with certain other art historical objects and see if you can say something about this. This was quite spectacularly done by François Desroches when he started looking at manuscripts in the so-called O1 style. This is in his Qur'ans of the Umayyads, where he shows very nicely that a lot of the ornamentation is actually very similar to, say, early Umayyad mosaics on the Dome of the Rock and these kinds of things. And shows, well, clearly there's some kind of connection going on here, which means that we must be placing these manuscripts in the Umayyad period. And then you look at other manuscripts, like these look clearly earlier, less developed, so they must be even earlier. And through kind of placing these things in relative chronologies and using the few dated manuscripts from later that we have, we can kind of get an idea how old are these things. So that's one of the important things that we do with the study of the scripts. Other things of the study of these manuscripts is, okay, how did the spelling develop? What kinds of variants do we find? We do sometimes, it's rare, it should be said, we do sometimes find variants in the text that are different from what we have today. And sometimes meaningful differences, something that actually affects the text. And that's something, of course, where people who are interested in, more text criticism and that kind of side of the Quranic text are very interested in. So that's another side of this. And then to some extent, what I'm myself interested in is indeed just real textual history. Where does the text come from? How did these texts interrelate? Who copied from whom? How did that develop? Where did it get started? And who standardized the text? These kinds of questions are things that we look at.
And you're talking about some of the dating of some of the manuscripts that we have. What's the date of our earliest manuscript of the Qur'an? And what's the date of the first complete copy of the Qur'an?
Yeah. That's well, they're not easy questions to answer. So since we have so very few dated manuscripts, it's hard to say. But we have a couple of contenders for the earliest manuscripts, which some of them have been carbon dated, which helps a lot, but at the same time sometimes give strange results. And strange results because they disagree a lot from one another, etc. And some of them are dated earlier than ones that look older to our eyes, which is a very subjective thing. So sometimes we need to take these things seriously. But the earliest manuscripts that we have come from, say, the early 7th to mid 7th century. So let's say, so for carbon dating, we get them around 650 to 700 already. And 650 is the traditional date that the Quran got standardized. So we really have them that early. There's some reasons to be a little bit skeptical of the exact dating of that. There's questions that are kind of technical and which should definitely be left up to experts, which I'm not. Haytham Sidki, for example, who is also very active on Twitter, has much better understanding of these things and says that there might be a reason to expect a offset of about 19 years from the date that the carbon dating gives. That would give some of these dates a slightly less awkward dating, but even then we still have a lot to do before we really know how to integrate the carbon datings that we get. That being said, they do start to converge. The ones that we consider old are definitely always dated earlier, and the ones that we consider late tend to be dated later, and they do all converge around the 7th century. It's clear that whatever's going on, even if we're apparently completely wrong, I'm a big proponent of the traditional story of the standardization of the Quran. But even if that turns out to be wrong, it's not going to be wrong by 50 it's not going to be wrong by centuries. It's going to be wrong by decades. And when we look at complete Qurans, the earliest manuscript of the Quran that is complete is probably Arab 399. And that is a manuscript that is held in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. And that is really much later. It's written in a style that is quite typical for the mid-3rd Islamic century. But its official date that is written on it is somewhere in 190 Hijri, 180 maybe, which is much earlier than other manuscripts in this style. If that date is correct, which I don't think is completely unrealistic to be correct, then that would be the earliest example of a complete Quran that has an actual date on it and is just completely present from front to back, basically. We have other manuscripts which are probably earlier, which are basically complete. There's one manuscript in the Topkapı Palace in Turkey, which is more or less complete. It has a couple of pages missing here and there, but it's just clearly due to damage and not because those pages were not there or anything like that. And that's probably mid-8th century, maybe a bit earlier than that. Who knows? It's hard to say because we don't have an exact date on these manuscripts. So that's kind of the overview of, say, the dating of these things. But really, already from very early 7th century, we have manuscripts, and that's quite clear.
And then, really briefly, what jumps out at an individual who's studying these manuscripts, which will help them determine the date of this particular manuscript?
Yeah. Well, it's hard. It's really difficult. So one thing that we kind of look at, but which I think is sometimes problematic. So there's a distinction between Hijazi manuscripts and Kufi manuscripts. And this distinction comes down to, well, first of all, for Hijazi, we often say they have slanted alifs and slanted ascenders. So anything that goes up high, so a lam or a kaf or an alif, but especially the alif, are very slanted. While today an alif would be written as a straight line, a straight vertical line, they are quite slanted in these early manuscripts. And it's clear that the very earliest manuscripts very often have these slanted alifs. And that slant disappears in the Kufi manuscripts. But that's not the only difference which makes manuscripts look old or late, and it would be very uncomfortable if we would only date by the slant. Sometimes things have been called Hijazi, which I don't think should be called Hijazi, just because they have a slant. Well, I don't think that is the main distinguishing factor. So if we look more closely, Kufi manuscripts, yes, alifs are straight. They have a little tail at the end, but they're not just a straight line. But they have a little tail at the end, but they don't have the whole slant in it anymore. And but Kufi manuscripts do a lot more. Kufi manuscripts are highly regular, have a clear kind of almost geometrical thing. Usually all lines are equidistant, straight lines. There's just as many lines on every single page, and there's a real geometry to the shape of the letters, which also starts making it very difficult to tell apart one hand from the other. So sometimes we have manuscripts which are written by multiple people. We see this all the time from the very earliest period to later, but at some point it becomes very difficult to see because it's so clearly controlled, it's so calligraphic, and they all follow this very specific style that it's actually very difficult to tell when one hand transitions to the other. Well, if you look at the earlier Hijazi manuscripts, it's much more free-flowing. The letter shapes are less identical. If you take any two words and place them over each other, they'll be quite different from one another. The letters will be bigger, smaller, etc. Well, if you do this in a Kufi manuscript, if you put them, it's almost like they use a stamp all over the place, and they have the exact same proportions everywhere. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but that kind of gives the idea of the difference. And we tend to assume that these much more exact, much more formal-looking scripts are later. That seems like a reasonable assumption, but it's worth pointing out that it's an assumption. So that's one thing that we go about these things. So if it's slightly less formal, looks more like other sort of written documents, then we consider them somewhat earlier. And at some point, really a holy script develops to start writing. I tend to be careful with this formulation because a lot of people say, yes, the earliest Quranic manuscripts just look like the documentary hand, the hand that we see in papyri. But anyone who's ever actually looked at both papyri and Qur'ans will know that even the earliest papyri are much messier than Quranic hands. The Quranic hand is already very clearly a book hand from the very earliest period, but it's much closer to the documentary hand and much more recognizable as being close to that. So that's one thing that we look at. We'll also look at the layouts. So how many lines are there to the page? At some point, manuscripts start becoming mostly written in a oblong format with fewer lines to the page. Well, originally it had a rectangular format where there's just it's higher than it is wide, and later becomes wider than it's high. So that's one thing. How big the margins are. Earliest manuscripts tend to have very small margins. So that's how some of these things are approached. Yeah, and so to get back very quickly. And there are some manuscripts, early manuscripts, I would say, that lack this pronounced slant in the aleph and just have a straight aleph, but in many other ways look extremely ancient, have all the similar kind of layout typicalities of what we call Hijazi manuscripts. And there's other manuscripts which clearly do have a slant, which looks much later. So the slant is a bit of a red herring. It's true that once you have the slant, it's probably early, but there need to be some other things going on with that as well. Ornamentation is another one. We see a development of how ornamentation is done, how verse divisions are marked, which tend to first just be dots, but at some point they start marking 10 verses, 5 verses, 100 verses, these kinds of things. And that system kind of develops more and more formally as you progress in time.
Thank you so much again, Doctor. I wanted to move on and ask you a bit about some of your major findings. You have a paper from 2019, I believe, The Grace of God as Evidence for a Written Uthmanic Archetype, the Importance of Shared Orthographic Idiosyncrasies. And I think this is a very important paper. And I believe I heard about it actually in early 2018 by a professor in an early Islamic history seminar class that I had. And he mentioned, I assume that this paper was presented before it was published. Professor Donner, actually,
yes.
He had mentioned it, and he was very impressed with the findings. And I think this was pretty convincing for him, and it was for me. And I think pretty much everyone else that I've discussed this paper with was pretty convinced by the findings. I was just wondering if you could just briefly just tell us what you did and what you concluded in this paper.
Sure. Yeah. Yes. So I had presented this before, and Fred Donner, I know him very well, and he got to hear it and was very impressed by it. So yes, it makes sense that you would have heard it sooner. So one of the main questions within, say, the history of the Quran is like, where does it come from? When was it standardized? How did this develop? And for a long time, especially in Western academia, there was a lot of uncertainty about when this happened, who did it, and whether it was whether we should consider the traditional narrative to be factual and historical or not. So let's first do the traditional narrative. The traditional narrative is that the third caliph, Uthman, around the year 650, decided to make a standard version of the text, presumably because of the expanding empire and fears that people might start developing very different versions of the text. They wanted to make sure that everyone agreed on a single standard text. He had this text made, distributed 4 copies, one to Basra, one to Kufa, one to Medina, and one to Syria. We don't really know what part of Syria, but Syria at least. And from there, copies were made in these different regions, and that's how it developed. Well, if that's true, which I think it is, and we'll get into it why, it would mean that the text was standardized very early, and that indeed, if we want to learn something about the language of the Quran, this is the very earliest document that we can use to understand the history of the language, etc., which is why I got interested in it. But I noticed as I was working on this that there was a lot of skepticism that was the case. Famously, in the 70s, John Wansbrough argued that actually the collection of the Quran was only complete about 200 years later. The field had definitely come together on agreeing that that is certainly much too late, but how much too late was still very much under debate, and how standardized was another question of debate. How big are the differences between these texts and between, say, two different manuscripts and these kinds of questions? And for me, it was obvious pretty early on that just looking at multiple manuscripts, these are incredibly close. There is minimal differences between these manuscripts, and I try to think of a way, how can I show that this is the case? And the fact that these are very, very minimal means that they're, one, very well preserved, and two, that already when we see the first manuscripts and the earliest manuscripts that we have really are part of a text tradition that is copied from one to the other, from an exemplar to a copy, written transmission, a clear written transmission. And that it wasn't just a oral memory that was being passed around. It wasn't being written down and copied through recitation, but really through copying from one to the next. A very faithful copying at that. So I look for a way to develop that. How do I show that this is the case? So what I did is I took one phrase, but I could have picked hundreds of others, but I took one phrase, Ni'matullah, the grace of God, which if you take, a modern print Quran, you'll see that this can actually be written in two ways. You can either write it with a ta maftuha or a ta marbuta, the ni'ma part. And so that's either with a ta or a ha, two different letters. And this phrase occurs 23 times in the Quran. 11 times in one spelling and 12 times in the other spelling. So, with an uneven number of things, it's basically 50-50. Well, seeing that kind of spelling, seeing that it's 50-50, you are confronted with the realization, well, apparently this was just random, right? This was up to the scribe to write in one way or the other. Apparently it was someone's choice to do this, and choice to do one thing in one place and one thing in the other. So, but that brings us to question, okay, where does this come from exactly? And so what I started to do is I started collecting this phrase in all Quranic manuscripts I could get my hands on. I look at, I think, 14 in my article, but I actually looked at like 30 more, and it just continues to be this pattern. And what shows is every single place in the Quran where you find one spelling or the other, every single manuscript agrees that in that place it should be spelled in that way or the other way. So they don't disagree with each other. All these manuscripts have the exact same spelling in the exact same place. And there's no other way to explain this except that they were basically copied from one another. Why? Because there's no difference in pronunciation. These are just two spellings for the exact same phrase. You cannot argue that it may have been pronounced some differently, whether there was something going on there, that maybe it was understood as something else. There's no doubt that we're looking at the same phrase. There's complete agreement that it's the same phrase, etc. And it's clear from the context that it's the same phrase, but spelled in two different ways. And in all these manuscripts, they keep on using the same spelling in the same place. Well, this can kind of be compared to a, so how this transmission works can be compared to, say, if you would have a student who hands in a paper and the contents of the paper are strikingly close to that of another student. Well, there can be two answers. You call them in and you say, hey, what's going on? These texts are exactly the same. And one student says, well, we just talked with each other about this paper, and this is just us just completely agreeing with each other, and that's why the text is exactly the same. That would be a kind of oral transmission that gives us this. But then if you start seeing that both papers have typos in the exact same place everywhere, well, it's completely unthinkable that two students would be making the exact same typos in the exact same text in all the same places. And when you find that, you know that one person basically just copy-pasted the whole text, and that's what we get. Well, that's what we find in Quranic manuscripts. Maybe people might find it somewhat unpleasant to talk about typos in the Quran. It's not quite a typo, but they are variant spellings. This is quite typical, say, in pre-modern, pre-standardized spelling practices. We often see that some words can just be written in multiple ways, and that's perfectly fine. That's what we see in the Quran, which is not quite the same as a typo, but it helps kind of conceptualize it. So this clearly shows a very early written transmission. It shows that every single manuscript, except for one, which we might get to in a second, but every single manuscript clearly derives from a single copy, and they were constantly copying from each other, and that's why all these spellings look exactly the same. So we know that there was an archetype. We know that there was a starting point from which all of this spread, and there are some reasons to assume that there were actually 4 copies from the starting point, which were indeed distributed to Basra, Syria, Kufa, and Medina, which is perfectly in line with the traditional narrative of how Uthman standardized it. That helps a lot make the case for an early standardization, that early standardization was indeed done by Uthman. So then I started looking at, okay, so we see these spellings and they're very clearly preserved and everything is there, right? All the wording is always the same. It's not just these words, just everything is more or less identical. There are some differences between manuscripts, has some differences in its copying, but getting this signal of an orthographic idiosyncrasy like this, where 2 words can be written in 2 ways, but people don't actually disagree when it's written in one way or the other, or manuscripts don't disagree with each other when it's written in one way or the other, that clearly points to a single archetype, a single beginning point. And then if you look at these manuscripts that have this signal, this archetypal signal, as I call it, they are dated so early, that is through carbon dating, that is through our paleography, so incredibly early, and still they must have still another ancestor that is earlier, that really, I argue, a much later date than the standardization of Uthman is really difficult to envision. Technically, this argument cannot argue for that it wasn't earlier than Uthman, say maybe in the Prophet's time, but I think if that was the case, the tradition would have probably communicated that. And the fact that it so explicitly doesn't, while it would have probably been nicer to have a completely written text earlier, is a good reason to assume that actually the attribution to Uthman seems to be correct, and that yes, the text was very well preserved from that very first point up until today, basically. And that's kind of the gist of the argument.
So thank you again for that, summarizing that very, very important paper, and I urge listeners to read that paper and to engage with it as critically as it possibly can. Again, yes, it's open access, and so there's less of an excuse. So I want to move on kind of to, I guess, the culmination of this discussion. So how does modern research agree or disagree with the claims made by pre-modern scholars of the Qur'an, and really the whole Islamic tradition, when it comes to its recording, its codification, its transmission, the fact that it's never been altered, and its verse numberings and surah order? And I can repeat this as we go on.
Yeah, sure. So one thing it shows is, well, first, this text was clearly codified early. We know that much. We know something about its textual history. We know how this text was distributed, how it ended up in different places. And we learned something about its spelling. So now that we have some certainty that the text was written down very early, which would have been clear for all kinds of other reasons. First of all, the spelling system that the Quran uses is radically different from, say, what later become, well, radically different is a big word, is quite different from what becomes the standard writing system. And it has very obvious hints that seem to suggest to me, at least, that it was indeed written down in the language of the Hijaz, in the Hijazi language, which makes historical sense if indeed the Quran was standardized in the Hijaz by Uthman. But of course, makes for some questions elsewhere. And it is clearly part of a writing tradition. It seems to know how to write things. It's not that this is the first time they're writing something, and it's also quite different, it should be said, from pre-Islamic Arabic written in the Arabic script from other regions. So if we look at more northern written Arabic, they clearly have a different writing tradition. So say this is the post-Nabatean kingdom, Nabatean Arabic writing. By this time, we start really seeing quite a lot of something that's very close to Arabic, with some Nabatean through it, and they really have different writing practices. They spell things differently, do things differently, and it seems quite clear that the Quran comes from a context where this writing practice has been adapted to the dialect of the Hijaz, and that they were using this already, which suggests that they really were writing in a kind of vernacular that they knew at the time and used this spelling to write the Quran. There's actually some transmissions in the tradition that mention this and say, whenever you disagree, make sure that you just spell it the way you should spell it if you would be a Qurashi. This tells us something at least about the literacy of the region, right? We know that there must have been something. It's not like they invented writing out of nothing. There was a long history of writing, but there's also clear innovations in the Hijaz that have happened between the pre-Islamic period and the Quran showing up. And there's a gap there. We don't have a lot of inscriptions from the pre-Islamic period, specifically from the Hijaz, especially from the relevant part of the Hijaz that is around Mecca and Medina. We don't really have anything. There should be a lot more archaeological research that should be done, epigraphic research that should be done, and hopefully some stuff will start showing up. But it seems to suggest that there was something going on with this. Now, when it comes to the codification of the text itself, and I'll do this together with transmission, really. So when the text was codified, the tradition says the Quran was codified without any dots at all, and it was quite an ambiguous, what we call rasm, a tracing, with only the letter shapes. I don't think there is compelling historical evidence to assume that that is true. What does seem true, however, is that it probably had very few consonantal dottings, and that indeed a good part of the text must have been somewhat ambiguous and not always clear how a certain word should be read, because multiple valid options are there. And this kind of multiple valid options we see actually appear in the reading traditions. We see that reading traditions sometimes read a sentence both as active or as passive, and it just comes down that it could just be read in both ways from the way it is spelled. Now the question is, what does that mean? So traditionally it said, well, these were different variants which were all revealed at some point during the career of the prophets. Whether that's true or not, really depends on how much trust you place in these transmissions. It's very difficult to be certain about these things. There's probably some truth to this. There's a very nice paper by Yassin Dutton who talks about orality in the Quran and talks about, say, this early transmission, where some of this variation comes from. And I think he makes a very compelling case that, yes, there was some amount of variation. And some of that variation may have ended up in the reading traditions that we have. But a lot of variation was also lost because there was now a standard text. And if you deviated from that standard text, you couldn't recite in that way anymore. And a lot of variation, I think, has probably also been added since then, because there was just, maybe the person had memorized the Quran in a different way than the text seems to suggest, and has the text in front of him, must adhere to this text, which is really one of the important keys of the readings that come after the standardization of Uthman, and come to a different conclusion, and that's where some of this disagreement comes from. That's at least how I look at this, and I think actually quite defensible, but not quite in line with I would say what the orthodoxy and how some of these variants happen. And so that also comes down to the transmission. Another thing is the Islamic tradition, especially today actually, very strongly focuses on the orality of the Quran. People have memorized it. People are able to memorize it, of course. Enormous amounts of text. Very impressive. I cannot pretend to be able to do that at all. But there's a very strong focus on this orality and oral transmission of the Quran, and sometimes to the point that the text itself is considered almost irrelevant. You get this every now and then on Twitter, where people go, well, even if the Quran would be lost today, we would be able to write a new copy the next day because everybody has remembered it. And while that's true, to some extent, you would be able to get the recitation back, but you would not necessarily be able to get the rasm back, the original written texts. And, well, some might say, well, who cares? It's about the recitation. That's the oral tradition. That's the one that matters. But that's clearly not how early Muslims thought about this text, because the fact that we can find an archetype from these minor spelling differences means they cared a lot about copying this text very accurately to the very minutest detail, that even when it doesn't actually matter in the pronunciation, they would still copy it precisely, like with the Ni'matullah example. And that kind of brings an interesting side to this. There are kind of two strands of transmission which are in interaction with each other. The oral tradition is not independent of the written tradition, and the written tradition is not entirely independent from the reading traditions either. But one thing that really shows very nicely that this is interaction between what is written and what is recited, and what is, say, transmitted orally. And one nice example of this is that among the Quranic manuscripts that we have, Quranic manuscripts can have what we call regionality. So what does that mean? These 4 early copies that we talked about. So there were 4 early copies made of the Quran: Medina, Kufa, Syria, and Basra. They have tiny differences between one another. It's about 40 places where they differ. And these differences are really minute. So it comes down to, whether a word starts with wa, and, or fa, or whether there's no word at all. Some of the regional differences can be slightly bigger. So you get this example where some readers will read qala, he said, instead of qul, say. These kinds of differences. And there's a couple of these. And these differences are reported by the Muslim tradition. It says, the manuscripts or the mushafs in Syria have these variants, the mushafs in Medina have these variants, and he lists these quite nicely. And these lists, you can use them on early manuscripts and actually see, look, this is clearly a Syrian manuscript, clearly a Medina manuscript. Sometimes it gets a bit messier, but it tends to get messier in later manuscripts. Early manuscripts are very, very accurately copied. Hopefully a very nice article by my colleague Haitham Sidki will come out on this topic, and he shows very nicely. It's very, very precisely. It's very precisely corresponds to what the tradition transmits. Now, if we look at the reading tradition, so the recitations that are used in these different regions, they follow the text of these different regional variants, the regionality of these manuscripts, very closely. And very often this is explained, well, clearly Uthman was aware of some of the variants that were around, and he just had these manuscripts made in these tiny differences and sent them out. I don't think that is the most likely way to interpret the data. As I said, the differences are minute, very irrelevant. None of them have any significant impact on the meaning of the text. They're just mostly, tiny variants. And if we look at what gets transmitted before the standardization of Uthman, there's much more variation. For example, readings before the standardization of Ibn Mas'ud, it has said to have, like real differences, different wording, different constructions, these kinds of things. And this is much smaller. So clearly, it seems that these variants just kind of snuck in during copying, mistakes, more likely than purposeful putting in some variation. Or maybe, it just wasn't quite as important. But these things happen. It's very few of them, only 40, with the thousands of words that are in the Quran, it's not that much. But it seems that these different readers from different regions had this manuscript and would indeed try to adhere to that manuscript as much as possible. They may have learned an oral tradition that was different and that deviated from the text, but now with the Uthmanic standardization had to follow it. And that means that their readings indeed follow quite closely exactly what is written in those texts. And that's what we see. So there's a clear interaction going on between what is written and what is spoken. And there's a kind of, it is not fully oral, it's not fully written transmission. There's something in between, and these things are going on. That brings us to the question, to what extent has the text been altered or not? That's a difficult question. It depends on what you mean by altered. Is a difference between saying, and in a certain place, or so in a certain place, wa or fa, is that really altering? I don't know. The text is very, very well transmitted, but really only after the written standardization. If we look at transmissions of earlier periods, so before the standardization, we don't have much of this. We only have very tiny tidbits here and there. We have that both from the tradition. We get some transmissions of, what some of the important companions had, what Ubay had, what Ibn Mas'ud had in their recitations, and these cannot agree with the Uthmanic text. They were clearly somewhat different. So it seems to show that there was some amount of oral variation, some amount of variation going on in the transmission of this text before the text was standardized. After the standardization, that variation was much more minute than before that, for obvious reasons, because there was a text you had to adhere to. So before that time, it was more varied, and the question is, was the text altered through that? Well, that depends on what you mean by altering. What is oral transmission of more or less what the text is supposed to say? There's not massive differences in meaning, these kinds of things. What is going on there? How do we understand this? And what's very interesting about this now is that we get a new insight into this, and that is from a Quranic manuscript. There's one manuscript, which is the Sana palimpsest, and this is a text. A palimpsest is any text which has a text that has been washed off or taken off, and a new text has been overwritten. And what's interesting about this palimpsest from Sana is it's a fairly big manuscript. We have a lot of folios, and it has an upper text, and the upper text is just your Uthmanic text. The standard text, I actually use it in my Ni'matullah article to show that, yes, it's just basically agreeing with the standard text as we know it. But the text that has been washed off is a Qur'an too. It is a Quranic manuscript, clearly a Quranic manuscript. And it agrees to a very large extent with what we have, but it's not an Uthmanic text. It is what seems to be a pre-Uthmanic text. This text, some wonderful work has been done by first Elizabeth Puin and then Behnam Sadri and Mohsen Godarzi, and later also by Asma Hilali. This text clearly deviates from the standard text in certain places. This means transposition of words or leaving out certain parts, assimilation of certain phrases and certain formulaic phrases which are very similar in one place or the other. And the surah order is different in this manuscript, which is also something that's reported for the companion codices. So Qur'an said, for example, Ibn Mas'ud would have had, it's transmitted that also had different orders of surahs. So in that transmission there's some amount of, so this is actually a very nice insight, like what a Qur'an would have looked like before the standardization of Uthman. And this has very obvious similarities with what gets reported by the tradition. It is exactly these kinds of tiny differences. Sometimes a difference in person, sometimes a difference in whether it's a passive or an active, sometimes some words missing, going around, these kinds of things. But the general gist of the text is more or less identical. And something which kind of brings home how similar these texts are is we can still use the standard text to navigate this palimpsest. So this lower text of the palimpsest, I should say. So we will still talk about, Surah Al-Baqarah, verse that number or the other. That works just fine. We'll find it. It's there. I think there's one place where two ayahs, so two verses are transposed, but mostly the verse order is exactly the same still. But within these verses, there are tiny variants here and there. So this is the kind of variation I think is likely to be attributed to a pre-Uthmanic time, which doesn't necessarily mean that the manuscript itself is pre-Uthmanic. It could be that after the standardization of Uthman, not all regions were immediately taking up this new standardization of the text and continued certain other textual traditions. This is transmitted, especially for Kufa, where people are said to have adhered to the recitation and the Mus'haf, so the codex of Ibn Mas'ud for quite a long time, for centuries after the thing. How much of that is true, how much of that is historical, is a big question. But we see that there was some amount of disagreement on whether you really had to stick to this Uthmanic text, and only the real orthodoxy of only sticking to that text may have taken a bit longer. And this brings us to questions of verse numbering, surah order. So in the Uthmanic text, the surah order is fixed, and in the Uthmanic manuscripts that we have, the surah order is identical in any single manuscript. We never find a difference. There's a tiny group of manuscripts that sometimes has slightly different orders. I'm working on that. I cannot say much about it right now. There's something going on there, but basically the standard Uthmanic text always has the same surah order. Also, it always has the same verse order. That's all the same. So it's just very accurate from start to finish. And so questions of, is maybe a whole surah, a whole ayah missing, whole surah missing, that just doesn't show up. It's very clear that this text was complete from the start. There's no conspicuous absences in early manuscripts. There's never one verse to the other that doesn't go in the order that we expected them to. Sometimes there's omissions. But very often we can understand these omissions as accidental omissions because two things, an I skipped, two verses were very similar. You accidentally continued copying somewhere else where you should have, and it very often gets corrected, sometimes even by the same scribe. Verse numbering, though, is quite different. Even today, the different reading traditions follow different verse numberings. So there is a Kufan numbering, there's a Medina numbering, there's a Meccan numbering, there is a Himsi and a Dimashqi verse numbering. And these differences are differences we see in manuscripts. And early manuscripts sometimes do strange things with verse numbering. And it seems that this was not quite as standardized as, say, the rest of the text. Apparently, you could have different opinions on where verse divisions were supposed to go, and we do find different opinions of where the verse differences are supposed to go. But even these seem to get somewhat stabilized quite early on, and we can often say, this manuscript clearly has a verse numbering which is related to the standard Syrian verse numbering that we know today, or this one looks like the standard Medinan verse numbering. But this is something we look at when we look at manuscripts. We look at regionality of the rasm, so some of these differences. We look at the verse numbering and how these differ from one another. So these are some of the things that we see.
And one final question while we're on the subject, and you did delve into this a little bit. Is there evidence in the manuscripts of a phenomenon that has not been recorded by scholars of Arabic or the Qur'an? And if so, what are the implications of this?
Yeah, so we do find this. So some of the variants. So when we look at the Sanam palimpsest, whenever I say Sanam palimpsest, I will mean the lower text. Some people are very pedantic about this. I'm not. The upper text is just not that interesting to me. So I'll say Sanam palimpsest. The Sanam palimpsest clearly has some variants which are not recorded by the tradition. It also has some variants which are non-canonical but do get recorded by the tradition. So that's cool. And that is something we see. Every now and then we see consonantal dotting in early manuscripts which reflect readings which are not recorded in the Islamic tradition. That's rare, but it occurs. What's interesting, though, is that in later manuscripts, these things change. And this is, we're going to talk about manuscripts that start using vocalization. That is, they start writing vowels. The earliest manuscripts don't have any vowels at all. So they don't have the fatha, the kasra, the dhamma, these kinds of things. They're all absent. They don't have a shadda. They can't write these things. They only write the letters. But at some point they start writing vowels. They start adding vowels, and they're gorgeous manuscripts. This is in the Kufic manuscript period, and they start using mostly red dots to write the reading traditions. So the reading traditions that are associated with the recitation of the Quran. And something really cool comes out of that. Once you start looking at that, you find that it is absolutely filled with forms that are not transmitted. Let me modulate that a little bit. So very often, specific variants that we find that are in these manuscripts, written in these manuscripts, are variants that are known to the tradition. They are recorded, and they'll say, yeah, you know, this person read it like this person read it like that. But as a whole, if you take these vocalized manuscripts, very commonly you find that they have systems and they have a complete reading which does not agree with the canonical readings as we know them. So let's go back to the canonical readings real quick. Canonical readings, as we know them, so there's 10 different readings, and these are systems. They're complete, right? So once you follow one reading of the Quran, you follow every single word is basically determined for you how you're supposed to read it. So every variant in wording is different. Every difference in grammar is basically done. So these are complete systems, start to finish of the whole Quran. The reading of Hamza is, in a sense, a whole Quran, so to speak. The reading of Warsh is a whole Quran, right? Then if you look at these manuscripts, you find, yes, they sometimes have known elements, but we cannot connect it to any one, certainly not to any one canonical reader, but not even to any one non-canonical reader. We find all these little bits, but the whole system that we find, and they're very often clear systems, they don't show up in a tradition. And we see that quite a lot, actually. And this is both in, say, the grammatical part. There are some real differences in how the grammar of these readings that we find in these vocalized manuscripts work, but also in the wording and how these wordings combine. And every now and then, especially in the grammatical part, which is the part I'm interested in, so that's why I know it better, it might also be in the readings, we find things that just do not get recorded by the tradition at all. The tradition records a lot of things, but some of these just don't show up. So I've been doing a research into the pronominal system of Quranic manuscripts together with my colleague Haitham Sidki. And we've been studying these vocalized Qur'ans and see, okay, what do we see here? What systems do we see here in the pronouns? And we're looking at the third person pronoun, which is the singular is, like we find in I don't know, kitabuhu, right, his book, or kutubuhum, their books, so hu and hum, and how these kind of develop. And there's this large group of manuscripts which does something interesting, something that none of the canonical readings do, which is they don't harmonize. What does that mean? Well, so if you would say in classical Arabic or in most Quranic reading traditions, you want to say to them, or to them you would say ilayhim, or to him you would say ilayhi, or in it you would say fihi. And then in these manuscripts we find endless examples where that kind of vowel harmony doesn't happen, and instead you get ilayhu and fihu, and sometimes we even find bihu. So we find this very different system. We find alayhumu, and while all these different variants are mentioned, the specific systems that we find in these manuscripts do not get recorded at all. We cannot look at these manuscripts and say, oh, that's this reader. It's not one of the canonical readers, but it's not even one of the non-canonical readers that get recorded. And that's because the non-canonical readers get recorded much less accurately. So there's a lot of stuff to be found there still, and you constantly run into this. And one of, say, my hobbies that I do with these kinds of things, I read the grammarians, the early grammarians, and every now and then the early grammarians say something strange and something that I do not recognize from the canonical reading traditions. Like, well, that's strange. I've never seen this in the canonical reading traditions. And then I open up the manuscripts and look at the manuscripts, and there it is, and there I found it. I had one of these things just the other day. For Sibawayh, he describes that the plural of Rasul is Rusul or Rusul without a U in the second syllable. So Rusul. I was like, well, that's funny. None of the canonical reading traditions ever do that. They always have a Rusul. And then I was like, well, okay, if Sibawayh describes it as a way of saying things, I bet it's there in one of the manuscripts. So I started looking in the manuscripts, and there it was. It just, was there in my face, looking at me, and there it was. And that just shows when you find that in a manuscript, that manuscript is not a canonical reading, because none of the canonical readers do this. And as I said, if you find one deviation, basically, you lose the whole system, because the whole system of a reading is every single word is determined. And then if you start looking further, you start seeing all these other deviations. So what does this mean? It means when it comes to the recitation of the Quran, there was a lot of difference of opinion. Not just so among the canonical readers, there's already quite a lot of difference of opinion, but there were many more opinions than just the canonical readers. The canonical readers get standardized in the 4th century, early 4th century Hijri, while they were active in the mid 2nd century mostly. So quite a long time after that. And they get standardized because they're supposed to be the most popular readings, etc. But really, we have manuscripts from the lifetime of the canonizer Ibn Mujahid that do not follow these standard readings. And a real shift seems to happen after the canonization. But how profound that shift is something that really hasn't really been looked into very much. But before that period, there's really chaos, a lot of different things, but not total chaos. There are manuscripts that have a non-canonical reading, one that's not recorded by the tradition, but they do agree with one another. They do have the same reading, so you can overlay them and see that they actually follow the same system. So they follow a system, they just don't follow a system that has been recorded by the tradition, which I think is quite exciting.
Thank you very much. That is actually very, very fascinating and indeed very, very exciting. As we conclude this episode, I wanted to ask, do you have any advice for students who are interested in pursuing these fields?
Yes. First, please do it. It's wonderful work. There's lots to be done. Recent years. So first of all, I mean, there's no program to learn this, right? I was going to teach a summer school course, but due to the coronavirus, this has been cancelled. And other than that, there's not really something to be done that way. And there isn't really a non-technical way of going about these things, but it has become easier than ever to work on this kind of material. There's lots of wonderful works out there by now. François de Roche's work is very important. Eleonore Sélar's work is very important. And Alain Georges has done wonderful work. Yassine Dutton has done wonderful work. And have been kind of laying out how you look at these kinds of manuscripts. How do you study these? And you can read these. You can look them up. You find them in the library. Or if you're lucky and have access through universities, you can just usually even download the PDFs. Really wonderful material that you can study. Also, I should mention Shadi Nasser's work on the transmission of the reading traditions. That's really wonderful. That's less interested in the manuscripts, but more in the reading traditions. It's really quite good, and a new book of his is supposed to be coming out very soon. But what's nice is that you have access to these manuscripts. Most of these are digitized by now. So one thing that should absolutely be mentioned, it's what got me into working on this material, is Corpus Qur'anicum. This is corpusquranicum.de. It's a German website. It's run by a group of researchers in Berlin. And it is just an absolutely fantastic research, especially for earlier manuscripts, not so much for later manuscripts, although they started incorporating those too, where you can look through the manuscripts and say, okay, I want to find this surah, this ayah, and show me this. And then it'll just display a manuscript, and I'll have a little menu. You can just look at all the manuscripts that have that surah and ayah. and you can just navigate by them. And some of them are transcribed, some of them only have the picture, but there it is. And um, that allows you to look at an enormous amount of manuscripts in a very short time. You can do this kind of comparative stuff, see how they differ from each other, and see how they look similar to each other, which very often they do. And also look how they look similar to each other compared to the modern print editions. There's some I would call mistakes, although some people don't like it when I call them mistakes, but mistakes in the standard text as we have it today. And where there's slight variations from how the early manuscripts write them. It's actually incredibly accurate, the modern print editions, but they do deviate sometimes systematically from the early manuscripts. The early manuscripts agree with each other. And looking at these early manuscripts, you can look at them, you can compare them, see how they're similar, and you can get something really cool out of that, like my Ni'matullah article. This basically was just born from that. I couldn't have done that without the Corpus Qur'anicum website. So that's really wonderful. But also the website of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, which has the largest collection of Quranic manuscripts out there, is really excellent for this. It's called Gallica. If you type Gallica, you find it, Gallica. And it just has all these manuscripts digitized. You kind of have to learn how to search for them, but that is something you can figure out. You need to know the numbers of the manuscripts, and then you can type the name of the manuscript. You can find them. Also, the Staatsbibliothek of Berlin is starting to digitize a lot too. So all of these things are starting to become available. It's sadly not really a good resource at the moment yet where you can find all these manuscripts. They're kind of scattered all over the internet, so you need to have some knowledge. But people can always tag me on Twitter and ask me, and I'll tell them where to find these manuscripts because they're in my head. Qur'an Gateway is making some work. This is another website. If you type it, you can find it. Right now, it's not too suited for the study of manuscripts, but is working on a database of all the different manuscripts and where they're scattered. Because very often manuscripts that we talk about, they're scattered through different libraries. So some libraries have some folios here, and other libraries have other folios there, and they kind of need to be brought together in a thing. But really, the best place to start is the Corpus Qur'anicum website. That has them all in place, and not all the manuscripts that I would want to use are necessarily there, and they're not always in the right quality, but they're a very good place to start, and that's easy to find and easy to navigate. You have to know some German. The website is in German. I think there's technically an English version, but just clicking around should probably help people along.
And do you have any projects that we should be looking out for? Any books? You were mentioning some stuff about it earlier.
Yeah. So I'm currently finishing up a book of my current research project. I'm doing a postdoc right now in Leiden on Quranic Arabic, which I guess has the title Quranic Arabic from its Hijazi origins to its classical reading traditions. I'm finishing up that right now, and I hope to finish that by the end of the school year, which should be in September, and then will of course take forever before it is actually published. So look out for that, but it's going to take some time. And the next project that I'll be working on is I'll be going to the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and I'll be working there for half a year from January 2021 onwards to look at these vocalized manuscripts. The ones I was just talking about that have these non-canonical readings. There's one group of non-canonical readings which seem to form a pretty close-knit group. They're all written in the same style. They all seem to come from Basra originally and have this kind of reading tradition which doesn't look like anything that was recorded. And I propose to look at these and kind of do I don't know, I'm not quite sure what it's going to look like. Is it going to be some kind of critical edition of just this reading tradition? I don't quite know what that's going to look like, but I'm going to be looking at those and very specifically at those. And after that, I don't know. I'm hoping some projects will go through in the future, but I'm still waiting for funding agencies to tell me they'll give me a ton of money to do it. But for now, I am only looking forward to the work in Princeton. So that's what it's going to look like for now. Yeah.
And I wish you all the luck, and I'm sure people who are familiar with your work also are really looking forward to more of the stuff that you produce. Thank you again so much for giving me so much time. This was such a detailed and informative discussion. I really hope our listeners can benefit from it.
It's wonderful. It's great to use this format once to talk about these things. Very often I'm either on Twitter or writing about these things, but talking about it is quite fun as well. So it's great to do this. So thank you for having me.
Yes, absolutely.